JAT Chat, presented by the Journal of Athletic Training, the official journal of the National Athletic Trainers Association. I'm Dr. Shelby Baez, an assistant professor in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science at UNC Chapel Hill, and the co-host of JAT Chat. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Gianluca Del Rossi. Dr. Del Rossi is a professor in the Department of Physical Therapy at Creighton University. He is the author of Student Debt Associated with Entry-Level Athletic Training Education, published in the Journal of Athletic Training. Dr. Del Rossi, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some insights on our recently published manuscript. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So starting off with a very broad question for our listeners, what prompted the investigation into education-related debt accrued by entry-level certified athletic trainers?
Sure. So for starters, student debt's a hot topic issue with implications for obviously the borrower, but also their family members, employers, our profession. But for me personally, as an educator, I had an interest in learning more about it because I wanted to kind of learn more about what my students would be experiencing post-graduation. And unfortunately, to my surprise, when I went to the research literature, there really wasn't anything there to be found. And so that really was the impetus for this investigation.
I love hearing that you were really wanting to do this to help your students and to figure out how you can help them on their next steps and their next journeys. Can you just describe a little bit about how you assess education-related debt in your article?
So a colleague and I developed a survey, and so that was really the instrument we used to collect our data. It was a pretty comprehensive survey with numerous questions that included questions about the total debt accrued in their effort to complete their athletic training degree. We asked about entry-level salary. We asked about monthly payments. We asked about interest levels. I mean, a slew of questions. And then using that data, we compiled averages, but we also calculated a few different kind of ratios that kind of gave us an indication not only of the scale of the student debt across our profession, but also the scope, kind of potentially what kind of an effect might it be having on our AT colleagues. So we sent that survey out via the NATA survey service to over 18,000 athletic trainers. And we had nearly 2,300 who completed the survey to some degree. And so the manuscript really is a collection of the data we obtained from those nearly 2,300 participants.
It was certainly a comprehensive evaluation of this education-related debt. And when I was reading the article, there was a specific term, education-related debt to income ratio. Can you just tell us a little bit more about this term and how you all interpreted it?
Sure. Appreciate the question. So debt to income ratio in general is a measure or an indicator of financial well-being. You can put either a negative spin to it or a positive spin. Some may refer to it as an indicator of financial burden. Some mean as an indicator of financial health. But I like to say it's a measure of financial well-being. And really what it is it's a measure of how much of their salary is going towards their repayment of the loan. So there's really two different debt to income ratios that we assessed in our investigation. So it's kind of just a broad debt to income ratio or education related debt to income ratio. That's basically considers one's overall student loan balance as a percentage of their gross annual survey. And the finance world or finance experts recommend that be 100% or less. That is to say that your entry-level salary your student debt should not exceed your entry-level salary. As part of this investigation, we also collected we also calculated, what's called monthly payment debt to income ratio. And that really is a kind of refers to the percentage of one's monthly income that goes towards servicing their student debt. And that's calculated by taking their monthly payment divided by their gross monthly income. And of course, the finance world has a threshold for that. And the recommendation being that be no more than 10% with an upper limit. They refer to it as a stretch limit of 15%. And so we reference those a lot and use those numbers to kind of give us a glimpse into really I like to say the kind of the scope of the issue. How was their student debt potentially affecting our AT colleagues? So that's the reason for including that in our investigation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So just to clarify on my end to make sure that I'm using the right terms here. So when we're saying this education related debt to income ratio, we want to see ideally 100% where the salary isn't exceeds the amount of debt that someone has accrued as part of their education expenses. And then from that monthly to education related debt to income, we don't want to see more than 10%. Is that correct?
Correct. Correct. And the reason for that again is, if you're above those thresholds, the indication or the suggestion is that your most of your money or a fair amount of your money is going towards paying those debts as opposed to going towards, other expenses that you may need to offset, your housing, food, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So when thinking about your study now, what did we see? What are the results of your study? What's the average amount of debt that entry level athletic trainers have?
Yeah, the this is the good stuff now. So when we looked at the data across all respondents, nearly 2,300, we found that the average student debt was around $62,000. Now, we know that a few years ago, our profession transitioned from an entry level undergrad to an entry level master's degree. And so we had respondents who had completed their degree at either of those, and so we decided to break up the data in that way by the level at which they obtained their AT degree. And so when we did that, we found that those who completed their degree at the undergraduate level, the average student debt was about $52,000, and for those who completed their degree at the graduate level, that was close to 86,000. Now I need to be clear on one thing there. With that 86,000, that number includes the debt accrued to complete their pre-professional degree as well as their professional degree, because in essence, that's the amount of money they needed to take out to be able to practice as an athletic trainer. And then, as I mentioned previously, we also looked at debt to income ratio because in our opinion, that gives us kind of an indication of the kind of, what the scope was of or how the student debt was impacting, our AT colleagues. And so for the general education related debt to income ratio, the average was 169%. So that's well above the 100% threshold. Once again, if we break that down according to the level at which they obtained their AT degree, we found that for those who completed their degree at the undergraduate level, their debt to income ratio was 146%. And for those who completed it at the graduate level, that number was 225%. Again, both numbers, in some cases, well above 100%. And then lastly, in terms of the monthly payment debt to income ratio, the average across all respondents was 14.4%, above the 10% threshold, just below the stretch threshold of 15%. When we again break it down by the degree level, those who completed the degree at the undergraduate level, that number was 13.9%. And for those who completed it at the graduate level, that number was then 15.7%. So again, above the 10% level, and in some cases, even above the stretch limit of 15%.
So what I'm hearing is that our financial pieces, as we're thinking about transitioning to that next step, our athletic trainers may be experiencing some financial struggles and may not be meeting our financial benchmarks that are recommended to be able to live a successful life.
That is correct. Yes, that is in essence the conclusion to our paper. But I'll wait for a little longer before we talk about that.
So just to follow up with some special considerations, when you were looking at differences between public and private institutions, what did you find? And then did you see any type of racial or ethnic minority disparities when compared to their white counterparts?
Yeah, great question. I get that a lot, and I appreciate it. We found that actually attending a private institution to complete the AT degree added considerably to the student debt accrued by those individuals. In fact, attending a private institution added on average about $11,000 to the total amount that was accrued. We also found, interestingly, that the benefit of attending a public institution was diminished and almost negated if that public institution was out of state. So definitely something to consider if you're trying to keep your loans to a minimum. In terms of racial disparities, sadly, we did confirm that those exist in athletic training as they do in other healthcare professions, and really a pattern that we've also seen kind of nationally. More specifically, our data indicated that African Americans and Asians students reported having higher student debt, usually on the level of $16,000 to $17,000 more than white students, and even greater than that in comparison to Latinos, Hispanics, and those of Spanish origin, who tended to have, on average, the lowest amount of student debt. This is certainly of concern because it can affect diversity within our profession, because high student debt can serve as a barrier to minorities wanting to enter the field and perhaps remaining in the field. So definitely something to consider.
Well, I really appreciate you all taking the time to look at some of those disparities that may exist. And also by clarifying the caveat between the public versus private institution and out of state versus in state. So lots of things for us to consider. So what would you consider to be some of the next steps in this space to help to reduce maybe some of these financial challenges experienced by athletic trainers related to their student debt?
Yeah, I think that, while we certainly can make some recommendations, my personal recommendation is that we study this further. I think that when it comes time to implementing steps, actions, or next steps and actions, we need to be intentional. And so my recommendation really is to study this further so that we can really learn what the needs of our AT colleagues are. And so I think next steps, we should learn about what are the personal implications and even the professional implications. And I think only when we have that information can we as a profession, can we as educators, can we as program directors, university administrators, can we be kind of really proactive with the steps that we take? So that would be my recommendation. Although obviously there are things we could do now in advance of that, but that would certainly be my recommendation.
Thank you so much for those thoughtful recommendations. Now, what would be the one thing that you would want our listeners to take away from this interview? Could you provide a take home point for our listeners about your paper?
What I'd like for the readers to take home is that when you're looking at or studying or examining student debt, I think we need to look beyond the raw numbers, those dollar figures. I mentioned previously the average of 62,000. While that number, relatively speaking, may not be large, and is not as large as the debt amounts accumulated by our colleagues in occupational therapy, physical therapy, and in physician assistant, when we take into consideration the salary and look at those debt to income ratios, what we find is that it's clear that our colleagues, or at least some of our colleagues in athletic training, are experiencing or have experienced financial challenges. So just something to consider for the future.
Thank you so much for that take home point. And thank you so much again for joining me today. I really appreciate the conversation that we
Again, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
had. And to our listeners, this article is available free of charge by the Journal of Athletic Training. And I'd highly recommend everyone go and download this manuscript in the journal. Again, thank you so much, and we will see you next time.